What's up, everybody? This is Action Jax, your fearless navigator through the infinite depths of entertainment and pop culture. Thanks for joining me here today on the very first episode of Wet Paint, the brutally honest review show that discusses new movies, television shows, anime, and more. Today I'm here to discuss the new DC animated film Batman: The Long Halloween, Part 1. So let's get into it. Batman: The Long Halloween was originally a 13-issue comic book series written by Jeff Loeb and art by Tim Sale. Released in 1997, it tells the story of the mysterious Holiday, a serial killer striking fear and paranoia into the hearts of the two most powerful crime families in Gotham, led by Carmine Falcone, the Roman, and Salvatore Maroni. When Falcone's nephew Johnny Vitti is murdered on Halloween, the only clues left behind are an untraceable .22 caliber pistol and a jack-o'-lantern. As the months go by, Holiday continues killing members of the two mobs, each coming on major holidays. Police Captain Jim Gordon and District Attorney Harvey Dent team up with Batman in an attempt to unravel the mystery, piece together the identity of Holiday, and stop him or her before the crime families explode into all-out war. Loyalties are tested, Gotham's greatest criminals are on the loose, and one of Batman's most iconic villains is born amongst the chaos. Before we get into the review, I want to quickly preface that this video will be filled with major spoilers for both the comic and the animated movie. So enough of that. Let's talk about Batman: The Long Halloween, Part 1. This was one of the first comic books that I actually read, and I think it's actually one of my favorite comic books overall. So when I went into the comic book store for the first time and I was deciding which comic books I wanted to pick up, this was one of the first ones that I saw. I loved the style of Batman. I thought it was really interesting just going through the pages and seeing this unique art style. So while I might be a little bit biased about which Batman stories are the best, this comic book was one of the first ones that influenced me in my life. So you have to imagine I was quite excited when I saw that DC was going to release an animated version of this story. Unfortunately, I have a lot of problems with this. Before I really get deep diving into the actual story of it, I wanted to talk about the animation, the editing, voice acting, music, all that kind of stuff. So let's get right into it. The first thing you're gonna notice when you get in is that the art style is not the same as the comic book. And I think that that's actually a mistake, because the art style that Tim Sale did is so unique and different. Obviously, Batman looks awesome. And I think that they did a really cool look with a lot of the villains. That being said, I don't actually really care for the animation style. I think it looks similar to a lot of what DC is putting out maybe in the last 10 years. That Batman is not this hulking beast of a man. While I can respect the choice that they made here in changing the animation style, I think they lost an opportunity to really put out a unique looking Batman story. And while it might have turned off some of the newer fans, I don't know if that's entirely who they were trying to go for here. If you're trying to tell a Batman story that is 20 plus years old, then why are you trying to bring in an animation style that looks like something that they just did? You're going to be looking for fans who already understand and know the story that are going to be excited to watch this. I think they made a mistake here. Now, the animation itself is okay. There are times in which I think it actually looks pretty weak. There's a lot of rigid movement. There's a lot of problems when it comes to certain action sequences, especially when they're trying to draw something from a distance. However, the animation actually flows really well during some of the fight scenes. When you have the fight with the Chinese mob and you have the action sequence with Joker on the plane, I think the animation looks really, really good. I think that there's a good seamless transition between some of the CGI elements and the hand-drawn look. Again, if this were a different Batman story, maybe loosely interpreted off of The Long Halloween, I think I would have a lot less problems with it. It doesn't end up working for me. Now, one of the biggest problems I have with this overall is the editing. I think that the editing is sluggish. I think there's a lot of times where it feels copy and paste. And while the action sequences themselves are edited quite well, one of the biggest problems you have is trying to get the intention and set up and cause and effect from the previous scene and trying to transition it into the next one. Every character has a motivation, and by the end of that scene, getting some kind of answer. They do not necessarily need to solve that problem, but there needs to be some kind of conclusion to the idea that's presented in the story. There are plenty of scenes where basically nothing happens of any consequence to the scene that came before it or the scene after it. Overall, I don't think that the editing is particularly good. I would say that this is at best cookie cutter and at worst distracting. So next I want to get into the voice acting, and I feel like this is extremely hit or miss. Yeah, I think probably one of the two highlights of this is Harvey Dent and the Joker. Part of the reason why is that it comes down to what it is that the character is actually expressing in the scenes that they're in. Harvey Dent at first is kind of monotoned, but he at least has a little bit of range when it comes to his emotions. Right up front, Harvey is actually upset that Vitti was murdered and that he was going to testify up front. You actually get some range when it comes to his character. You also get that as well when he transitions into the Two-Face character. The other highlight I think is the Joker, and I honestly thought at first that this was Mark Hamill doing the voice, and I was super excited. But when I actually looked up the credits, I found out that it was not, and I thought that overall he did a great job, the voice actor, really bringing that chaos and unpredictability and weirdness to the Joker character. Now, second, we've got Bruce/Batman, and I'm not particularly impressed by the direction that this character was given. I don't necessarily have a problem with the voice actor because I think that there's a certain brooding that's going on with Bruce Wayne as a character, and I think that that could be part of the overarching narrative that Batman is still new to this. However, there's not a lot of range when it comes to his character. Basically, Bruce Wayne is single note through the entire thing, and Batman is single note through the entire thing. When Bruce is vulnerable, you want to feel those little moments of vulnerability in his voice. And you're not going to get a lot of anger or angst from this version of Batman as well. And I'm not necessarily saying that Bruce Wayne or Batman need to be way up and down on the scale of emotionality. But at the same time, there's not a lot to work with here. And I don't know if that's really necessarily the animation's fault or the voice actor's fault. Maybe they recorded the voiceover before the animation, maybe they did it afterwards. But overall, I don't think that the Bruce Wayne or the Batman that we really wanted came through in this story. Next up is the music, and overall, I think that this is kind of bad. You have action scenes that legitimately do not have any kind of tension or excitement built into them. I'm watching a scene with Batman and Catwoman chasing each other, and you're supposed to feel excited. You're supposed to feel tension. You're trying to put yourself in that moment, and ultimately, it ends up being boring. So you're relying on the animation itself to bring this across on its own. And in this first action sequence, it fails miserably. I think that it's long and boring instead of being tight and filled with tension and action. Now, there are other moments later on that I think do a pretty good job of this, especially in the quieter moments, that I think that there's a really good atmosphere being built to this. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the sound effects when it comes to this area, and I think that they do a really good job of this. For example, you're underground and you've got Solomon Grundy coming and you can hear the thumping, you can feel like the water is rushing through the sewers, little drips. The problem with this is that the sound effects are just a part of the larger atmosphere being presented to us in this story. The sound effects themselves can't do that. All it's meant to do is to help bring you into the moment physically, not emotionally. So overall, I have to say that the sound design work is not good. There are some bits that are well done, and there are other parts that I feel fall flat completely. So now I want to get into the story real quick here, and I have two huge problems with this story. The first one is the setup. In the comic book, you have Bruce Wayne at the Falcone building and they're having a conversation. And the first thing we see is Bruce Wayne looking at us as the readers and saying, "I believe in Gotham City." And this is a great setup because it shows you where Batman's headspace is. And in the animated film, it starts off with this monologue from Falcone talking about how Bruce's father helped him and was good for the city and all these things. And you can tell that Falcone just wants something from Bruce. In the comic, you know what that is because very quickly afterwards, you have a scene where Bruce is at the Gotham City Bank and he's on the board and he's talking with the members who are pretty corrupt. And they want to allow Falcone to be able to bring his money and launder it through the bank, and Bruce does not. This does not happen at all. There's some passing conversations that are going on, but it doesn't seem to have any real stakes. It doesn't seem to be actually a part of the story in any meaningful way. Now, we do find out later on that Falcone is keeping his money in this storage building. And the way that we get to that point is through an action sequence in the film. It's basically like, hey, there's a murder that happened. We don't know the stakes of this murder. And all of a sudden now we want to go after Falcone. In the comic book, we know that Harvey Dent is trying to take down Falcone. We know that Bruce is involved by trying to get access to the Falcone safe. And in that safe is a book of important documents, dates, people, transactions. That's why he's there. In the beginning of the film, Bruce is just there talking to Falcone and we don't really know why. Now, it's in a passing moment that Falcone mentions like, oh, Bruce isn't gonna end up actually allowing for this transaction to go through, but it doesn't really matter. There's no stakes. Now, the second biggest problem I have, I think, is the biggest one, and that has to do with Holiday themselves. And I say themselves because in the comic book, it is implied that there are multiple Holiday killers. And in this animated story, that's completely changed. And one of the first places we really understand this story is not going to be the same is when we run into Alberto. And Alberto in the comic books is Falcone's son. He's a college guy. He's left out of the family business. You can tell that Alberto wants to be involved in some capacity, but Falcone doesn't really see him as being useful to the family business. In the animated story, Alberto is a joke. He's laughed at, he's made fun of. He's basically seen as useless and a failure. So in the comic book, this drives Alberto to get his father's attention. And one of the ways that he does that is that he takes up the moniker himself as Holiday, and he starts killing some of these mob members. This is where we get the big problem. And the big problem here is that later on in the animated story, after we see Alberto being basically mocked and belittled by everyone around him, Alberto is shot by the Holiday killer and falls off the edge and is shredded to pieces by a propeller. In the comic book, Alberto is seemingly killed and falls off the edge of the yacht. It is implied that he was killed by Holiday, but we find out much later on that he staged his death and wanted to transcend the idea of what the mob was doing for control. He sees that there are these other villains that are going around and they're getting much more done. He wants to do that himself. And there's this great scene later on when Harvey and Jim and Batman all teaming up to set a trap for the Holiday killer. And it turns out that it's Alberto. So why is this such a big deal? Because it changes the entire underlying idea of who the Holiday killer is. In the comic book, it is implied that there could be multiple Holiday killers. And by the end of the comic book, you're still questioning who did what. It's actually really, really interesting. It is a detective story. And the animated film is basically the skeleton of The Long Halloween with major plot points filled in with other things that try to fix these earlier scenes. Ultimately, now you have to go in and refill those scenes with other less important expositional scenes. Another problem we have here is with Harvey and Gilda. In the comic book, Harvey and Gilda have, yes, maybe a little bit of a strained relationship, but you can tell that they love each other, that they care about each other. In the animated film, you have this very confrontational and depressing atmosphere going on. They're arguing. These things are not shown in the comic book. And I think that the only reason they do that is because they changed so much that they needed to bring in a new dynamic to the story. So overall, I just want to say that I think that the story itself from the comic is fantastic. I think it's a great detective story. It leaves you on the edge. You want to know what's going on, and you're basically inside Batman's shoes. You're figuring it out along with him. You don't know if Jim Gordon's involved. You don't know if Harvey's involved. You don't know even if Bruce is involved. They do a really good job of showing the perspectives of the other characters and the information that they receive that might actually pin it onto Bruce himself. So when it comes to the story, I think that there's a lot of problems here. They took out scenes that were super important. to the underlying narrative of the story and replace them with scenes filled with either exposition or extended fight sequences, or that even take place in the story. So I want to give my final thoughts. Overall, I think that Batman The Long Halloween Part 1 is very problematic. So you have a story that is kind of butchered and slow and plotting and kind of boring. And then you've got animation style that doesn't match the original comic and at times can be very good and at times can be very rigid and kind of bland. The music, voice, and sound effects are a total mixed bag, at times actually doing a great job and at other times being downright bad in my opinion. So if I had to go ahead and give this a final score, I'm going to say that the Batman The Long Halloween is very forgettable. And that's really disappointing to me because I love the comic book and they decided to make drastic changes to the underlying story, which ends up hurting the project as a whole. It's not really worth your time and I'm really disappointed in that because this was something that I was looking forward to when I saw that it came out. I had been sitting on this idea for a long time. Part of me is thinking, oh damn it, why did I choose this? I thought this was gonna be awesome. Instead, my first review is, it's mediocre, don't waste your time on it. Of course, I'm gonna be reviewing part 2 as well and try and wrap up the entire story as a whole. Overall, the final score, I'm gonna give this a 4. So before you go, I just wanted to say thanks a lot for your support. It really helps me keep going and really just allows me to do more stuff in the future. In the next video, like I said, I'll be reviewing Batman The Long Halloween Part 2. So we're gonna wrap up the story with the Holiday Killer. We're gonna discuss the multiple changes that were made to the story as a whole and come to a kind of a definitive conclusion about the 2 movies. So if you liked the video, leave a like, maybe a comment, and please subscribe for much more content in the future. If you didn't like it, hey, I appreciate you sticking around this long, and I do hope to keep improving and making better videos as I go forward. So you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and I have a Patreon that will hopefully be coming out at some time in the future. So this is Action Jax, your fearless navigator through the infinite depths of entertainment and pop culture.